My mum had a cat for 15 years before she had to put it down. The first pet she got after she and my dad got together. He'd cuddle, nurse on your neck, and talk to you. Really one of those forever kitten types. Every now and again, she'd still dream about him. Little peaceful dreams where he'd usually do nothing more than sit on her lap, purring or kneading. Sometimes, when we were on the phone, my mum would say, "Sugar visited me again last night," in a nostalgic sort of way. I always kind of patronized her, until a very close friend of mine passed away due to brain cancer. He'd visit me in my dreams, talk to me, and do silly stuff like we always used to do together. One time, I got this kid to take swigs of gin, followed by bites from a block of cheddar. One time, I realized an entire road trip I'd taken on bus with him was just me traveling alone talking to myself. That was very cruel of him, to just disappear like that. I'm a writer, so although I don't necessarily believe in ghosts, I wrote to him in a journal he gave me for my birthday. I asked him to please stop visiting me. It was too much. It hurt. And just leaving me like that was like losing him all over again. The next night he came to see me one last time. He put his arm around me and said, "It's okay, I understand." And with that goofy, sad smile on his face, I cried on my shoulder and let myself feel the relief of saying goodbye. And I haven't seen him since. This happened on New Year's Eve 2010, turning into 2011. My dad, sister and I were at my uncle's New Year's Eve party. I was 17 at the time, my sister 15, and between me, my sister, our two cousins, and aunt's relatives' kids, there were about 10 teenagers at this party. Some important background. At the time, we lived in a rural area in central Florida, and while the area for the most part was a nice place to live, there can be no denying that it is deep south, and some areas are still more bound to be the old ways of the South than others. It's also important to know it's just how deep the bond between my sister and I is. Like I said, I was 17, she was 15, and she was and still is my absolute best friend. Just about everything I did and do, I did with her, and vice versa. We had all the same interests, friends groups, and what we didn't have in common, we still loved to share and try and introduce each other to. By every definition, we are inseparable. So here we are, a group of rowdy, loud-mouthed teenagers at a party. It's only about 9 p.m, and we were all restless, in need of something to do. One of us brought up the local cemetery that was a 5-minute drive from my uncle's house that was reputed amongst locals to be very haunted. Its oldest graves dated back to the late 1700s to early 1800s. It wasn't just the age that gives this cemetery its reputation, but rather its history. It was also the site of several lynchings of innocent black people by white supremacists. It was also where a woman was stoned to death for adultery and/or witchcraft, again in the late 1700s to early 1800s. Naturally, we convinced my dad and uncle to take us, so we all piled into the back of my uncle's huge truck. We girls in the cabin with dad and uncle and the boys in the back, and set off for some spooky exploration. To get to this cemetery, you must drive about a mile's worth of dirt road through virgin land. So a mile in the dark on a road completely canopied by enormous live oaks and palms. Forestry so thick, you can't see more than 15 to 20 feet in front of you. So it was already an unnerving atmosphere before we even arrived to the cemetery properly. Before we entered, the dirt road curved to the left, and on the outer part of the curve was a row of juniper trees that were around 20 to 25 feet tall. When that grove came into view, I suddenly saw a face peering straight at us from above those trees. It was the face of a young man, and when I say I saw a face, I don't mean I caught a brief glimpse of some transparent could-be face. This guy looked flesh and blood, and alive. I can even remember distinctly what he looked like. Medium skin tone for a black person, a broad flat nose, shortish curled hair, and green eyes that reflected in their headlights like a cat's eyes, and a completely blank, emotionless expression. I stared at him for a solid 5 seconds or so, before he just vanished. I sat there stunned, wondering if I should even say anything. But then, one of the other girls started to freak out. "Did you see that? Did you see that man?" she screamed. Keep in mind, those juniper trees were at least 20 feet tall, and there were no other trees or growths near them for another 30 feet or so. There was nothing he could have been standing on, not to mention the way the face just blinked out of existence. Still, we stopped, and one of the men looked behind the junipers out of curiosity. They found absolutely nothing and no one. Equally strange is even though he was dead ahead of us and very visible, only that one other girl and I saw him at the exact same time and no one else did. In the cemetery itself, a few other less pronounced things happened. But they boiled down to me and a few others in the group feeling a very negative presence. We left after about 5 minutes when we returned to my uncle's house. I noticed that my sister seemed off. She's usually more reserved, but now she's dead silent and very quick to anger, which was an unusual trait for her. Our uncle tried to lighten the mood by pranking us and throwing a firecracker into the garage. My sister, who is normally a fan of pranks, on top of being quiet, just looks over at him and shouts at him. Keep in mind she was 15 and still hesitant to be rude to her elders, southern upbringing and that, and it was kind of a dick move on my uncle's part, but certainly not worthy of an outburst, and it was very out of character. After a while, the conversation veered off and changed into a subject I had no interest in, so I got up to look at the firework. My sister got up and followed me, and as I said, we're inseparable. I walked out of the garage with my sister right behind me and to the side. I didn't pay her much attention as I was enjoying the fireworks, and a particularly big one went off, and I made some comment and she didn't respond. So I turned to look at her and repeat to myself, only she wasn't there. She was still sitting in the garage with the group, and this creepy zoned out 1,000-yard stare is plastered on her face. I'm telling you, I saw someone standing behind me. She was standing to the side and not completely behind me, but I saw her right at my shoulder, constantly in my peripheral sight. As soon as I turned to look directly at her, she vanished, or was never there to begin with, as she was in the garage. As the night dragged on, she got stranger and stranger. Her pupils were fully dilated, even when we brought her into a brightly lit room. Worse still, she complained of severe neck pain, and a rash began to form around her neck. A rash that was in the exact pattern of a rope burn on a hanging victim. The rash spread to no other parts of her body. Our dad had to rub on some antihistamine cream, and I looked it over, but it wasn't inflamed, swollen, or itchy. It was just there, more like a birthmark than a true rash. She spoke like she was drugged, very spaced out, not wanting anything except water. She kept complaining that her neck hurt. When we were freaking out over her pupils, she would just be like, "Oh, weird," and go for more water. By this point, we'd had enough and got some of my aunt's things. And my cousin, who had dabbled in all religions and is very spiritual, prayed over my sister, begged her to toughen up and give whatever was doing this the boot. Just a few minutes before midnight, her usual personality returned, and the flash faded as spontaneously as it appeared. The pupils stayed somewhat dilated for a while longer, and she complained of headaches, but otherwise she was fine. Whatever. At least it passed. We've discussed that night several times since then, but only recently did we discover a detail that made both of our blood run cold. Though neither of us can remember the exact time clearly, my sister swears she remembers going out to the car around the time we were in the garage, talking to the other teens. Somehow she mistakenly thought we were going to be leaving then, and she says she does not remember how long she waited in the car, but it was a while. A few minutes before midnight, she realized the New Year's Eve ball was about to drop, and we were staying for it, and then she returned inside. Only because she was never in the car. I kept her with me the entire time. I was genuinely freaked out, because even if it had nothing to do with that cemetery, I was genuinely concerned there may have been something medical going on, and was trying to figure out what it could have been. When I told my sister this, I don't think I've ever seen a look more terrified on her face. She genuinely only remembers just sitting in the car wondering where everyone else was. She passed out and was okay. When I was 16, I would jump on my trampoline out back for hours every night. Literally hours. I would listen to my iPod and just daydream to get away from a rough family life. One night when I was jumping, a kid ran past our fence at full speed carrying a box about the size and shape of a skateboard. He ran to the park behind my house and held it by the edge and tossed it into the air, so that it flipped a few times before landing on the ground. At this point I was a little weirded out, because he was just standing over it staring for a pretty long time. Then out of nowhere, he just bolts full speed back past our fence like he didn't even notice I was there. Alright, that's a bit weird. I just kept jumping and staring at where the box was. Here's where it gets creepy. The box looked like it was moving. Then something started to rise out of it. I actually stopped jumping and rubbed my eyes and watched as it looked like a fully grown man rose out of the box that was 2 inches thick. He had an elongated head with no hair. His skin was orange and his eyes were huge and pitch black. He raised one arm up to his side, and the box just kind of went into what I can only describe as a trench coat. He walked over to the only pavilion we have at the small park, grabbed the metal beam holding up the overhang, and began to bang his head onto the beam over and over. At this point I rubbed my eyes a few times and couldn't even move. I had no idea what I was seeing. Then without warning, he just stopped, and his head quickly whipped around and stared at me. It was like he could feel me watching him. A giant, and I mean a giant smile came across his face, and those dark eyes just stared at me. He tilted his head back and forth a few times, and I had goosebumps and my eyes began tearing up. Even typing this makes my hair stand on edge, because I'll never forget that look. As I was about to start crying, he turned around and kind of phased down the road into the distance. He was gone. That was it. I bawled my eyes out and sprinted inside and called my best friend, who assured me I was just seeing things and needed to calm down. I'm sure I sound insane and no one will believe me, but that is the creepiest thing that has ever happened to me. This happened to me while I was living in New Jersey, at least 6 years ago. I lived literally 30 feet away from the borders of New Jersey and New York. I am a normal guy mostly, but people around me tell me that I used to say a lot of weird things. One time while driving in a wooded area of rural New York, I said to my friends, "I wonder how many bodies are buried here that haven't been discovered yet." I felt like it was just a question, while being morbid at best. Not a great way to make people feel comfortable, as they all told me to shut up because they all got goosebumps. So even back then, a lot of people knew that I was more attuned to the nether side of the world. Thankfully, in my opinion, my ability began to fade. As I grew older, the mysterious nature of our world started to blend with our natural world that we see and hear. But one time, for a short moment, it made me question reality altogether. Back when I had a friend who was a very caring person, every time the holidays would come like clockwork, he would graciously invite me to his family's house for dinners and events alike. But this one Christmas Eve felt a little different, like I had a purpose to be there. Something or someone goaded me into being there that night. I was living alone by myself at the time, with my mum being in California and my sister in Ohio. It was good to just get calls from them during the holidays back then. I felt like I was living my life the way I wanted to. After coming back from work to my small room that I rented from this lady and her kid, I started to wind down from the ordinary day and drank some beers while watching Netflix. Time began to slowly fade away, and I was mindlessly watching the computer screen when I got a text from my friend, Kevin. Kevin also lived with his mum and sister one town over. He asked if I wanted to come over for Christmas Eve dinner, and since I only had packaged food on hand, I said okay. I thought the timing was a little weird, however. He said he'd come over around 9:30, and my family always ate earlier in the evening, but I shrugged it off and decided to go. I walked out my place at 9:15, and a short while later drove to his house. I hummed a little Christmas tune that was playing over the car radio, and not long after I parked my car in front of his house, I felt bad just waltzing into someone's home. So I grabbed what little wine I kept in my closet as a gift to his mum. It was my favorite bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon from my home state. Kevin's mum greeted me at the door, and she gave me a great big hug. For a short-statured woman, she always had this presence. Just being around her made you feel safe and warm. Kevin's house had a weird floor plan. When you enter through the front door, you're entering into a winding staircase and corridor. To the left was the bottom living space and storage room, and the door to the garage. To the right, you go up the staircase into the main living space with a warm fireplace and kitchen. It may sound strange, but when you enter through the front door, you would always hear a low grumbling or moaning towards the left. Kevin had a dog that wasn't very guest-friendly, and when she felt someone else other than her family, she would always lie down on the couch that was in the storage room. I thought to myself, well, Merry Christmas to you too, grumpy old dog. I always hoped she'd warm up to me eventually, but I guess it just wasn't in the plans after all. So we all headed towards the main living space or the kitchen for a warm drink. His mum was serving either beer or hot chocolate, and I'm confident I had both. Now the dinner wasn't served at Kevin's house because every holiday they would walk down the street and go to their aunt's house or previously his grandfather's house at the beginning of the street. Kevin had a younger cousin called Zeke, and to be quite honest, I haven't the faintest clue what his actual name was. We just called him that. Not that I really cared, of course. Zeke's mum was a saint, but his dad was an abuser. He didn't raise his hand on his wife, but verbally abused her since the birth of their son. Zeke gradually started to mimic his father and also berated his mother, which aggravated me to no end. Kevin and I used to make fun on his behalf as a joke or a small playback of him for dishonoring his mother. Zeke's mum was a great cook, and she also made lots of money as a major company accountant. I feel like her husband was always jealous about that. That nasty fat ass of a man. So her food was incredibly satisfying, and she cared for me like she was my own aunt. Anyway, after dinner, Zeke's mum and Kevin's family walked back to Kevin's house for a warm refreshment. I had hoped it was just a warm refreshment, but something curious was about to unravel. At the house, it was close to 11:30 now, and I began thinking it was time to head back. But Kevin actually told me I could stay a little longer. At the time, I thought, why not? It's not like anyone was waiting for me at my room. After grabbing warm refreshments, we all sat in the upper living space. There was Kevin's mum, Kevin's sister, and her friend, Kevin's uncle, not the fat guy, and Kevin's other cousin, in a perfect circle. It looked planned. Now, right before the actual thing happened, Kevin's mum explained to me that they all sat together on Christmas Eve to think about all the people they cared about who have passed and hoped that their spirits would join them on the holy night. She pretty much told me that nothing really ever happens, but they feel the warmness in the air and wish for a happy new year. Now, this would have been just fine, but among them was a conduit to the other side. Yep. They had a specific reason they asked me to come to dinner. I'm still always thankful for their care while I lived by myself in those days, but that night was something completely different. I was about to find out exactly what, in an unimaginable way. So as the clock was ticking, I began to feel woozy, like something in the air or atmosphere was beginning to change. Not exactly bad, but not really saintly either. I began to hear someone trying to clear out their throat in a corner between me and Kevin's sister. Clearly there wasn't anyone sitting there, but for me I could hear this person. It sounded like she was trying to cough, but nothing came out, or perhaps she was clearing her throat. I told Kevin's mum that there was someone next to me that was doing that, and her eyes became widened for a second, and she said Aunt Ruth was here with us. I asked Kevin who Aunt Ruth was, and he started to tell me he had a great aunt who passed at least a decade ago from throat cancer. She had one of these holes in her throat, just so she could breathe. I think it's called a stoma. And I began to sweat in my palms exactly when he finished telling me the story. Everyone was sounding ecstatic, except for me. I only felt dread. Then at the corner of my eye, I saw a small shadow darting from Kevin's mum's room. I started to sigh constantly and said to Kevin I was glad to see his other dog, Barney. I always had a love-hate relationship with Barney, because unfortunately while trying to pat his head, I accidentally poked him in the eye once. But Kevin sat next to me rigidly, looking as if he were in shock, and said to me that it couldn't be. I suddenly started to feel another pang of dread in my stomach, as Kevin told me that Barney passed away in the summer. I said it couldn't be, because I'd just seen his shadow as he ran towards his mum. Then Kevin wildly reported to everyone what I had just seen. They began to exclaim that it was incredible, or said that they felt blessed to have their dog back home one last time. But I sat in my chair and started to feel sick, shaking a little and just trying to process what was going on. That feeling of sickness only lasted for a second. Suddenly, out of nowhere in my eyesight, the one spot between Kevin and his mum began to shine. It was so bright I couldn't make out what it was, but I felt a very warm sensation, and it felt like someone was sitting there. The whole room enveloped in this warm glow and made me feel relaxed. even though something unbelievable was happening to me that night. I felt like St. Nicholas or the Holy Spirit was in front of me, but this being began to speak through me. It asked me to tell Kevin's family that everything will be alright, and the year after will have nothing but great news. I told Kevin exactly what I was feeling, seeing, and speaking. Kevin's mum started to whimper and sob about Kevin's grandfather, who was the pillar of the family. Now, the weird encounter wasn't finished. As I saw this light begin to extend its light to Zeke's mum, it asked me to tell her that things will only get better from here, and that she should not be afraid of the darkness that lingers in her home. As I began to tell her exactly those words, Kevin's mum and Zeke's mum began to sob together openly and loudly. Before this presence vanished, like how it appeared, it showed me its form. The being of light had a clear outline of an elderly man in a military uniform. He thanked me in my mind, and also told me to tell Kevin that he was proud of him for following in his footsteps. Kevin, after hearing what I repeated from this being, held his face in his hands, and his eyes began to well up. Then, it was gone. Now in my head this whole thing lasted only a few moments, but when I checked the time, almost 3 hours had passed. It was 2:30 a.m. when I rose from my chair. All the family members either gave me hugs or pats on the back, but to me it wasn't exactly something easy to swallow. It was either something amazing or terrifying. I can't really wrap my head around it. Should I feel like I was used, or was I a gatekeeper to the other side? I only had one more question that was left unsaid. What did it mean by the darkness? What lingers in Zeke's house? Who exactly sat in the chair that night? And what about the shadow? Do dogs even have souls or spirits? I can tell you it was the first and last time hanging out with Kevin's family on Christmas Eve. I think I was introduced into a seance without acknowledging the harm that could come out of it. I'm still not 100% sure whether or not I should be happy to have been of service. It's really strange to see something that others can't perceive. I also feel that the evening could have unraveled in a much different fashion, as well as a door that I'm not ready to cross or bear. When I was 15, we had to put my cat down due to kidney failure. I still kept seeing him around the house for over a year after he passed. Some people might find some comfort in that, but it really creeped me out. I did not like it because I didn't believe in ghosts, but I kept seeing him on the back of the couch or sitting in a hallway, like I would look over and he'd be there, and then in the blink of an eye he'd be gone. I know the explanation is that it's just all in my head, because I'd seen him in those spots every day for 15 years, and it was just what my brain was expecting to see. And when we moved away, it finally stopped. A few months after my uncle ended his own life, I had a dream where he was talking to me on the phone. In the dream, he was telling me to tell his daughters that he loved them and that he missed them a lot, but he talked like he was away in the military rather than dead. I also kept hearing weird clicking in the background. When I woke up, I mentioned everything to my mum, and she told me that when he was in the Navy he did Morse code. No one had ever told me that before or even mentioned it since I was alive. So it was weird that I remembered that part of the dream so clearly and made enough of an impression to mention it to my mum. I was on my dirt bike riding along some railroad tracks when I came across a tunnel and thought, hey, that looks like a good picture. I pulled out my phone and took some images. When I was done, I looked down the tunnel and I could see the other side, and thought I saw what appeared to be a little girl in a white dress walking towards me. I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, so I waited a second and that's when I heard a voice directly in my left ear whisper, "They hurt me." Let's just say I didn't know that dirt bikes would go that fast after that. I just started working in a lab in August. Since I started, my co-workers have told me all sorts of paranormal activity that has happened. I listened to their stories, but never put much stock into it. One day, about 3 months into the job, it was late, and I was setting up a specimen and ended up staying behind as everyone else left. The hood I was using was in a corner, and I couldn't really see anything except what was right in front of me without turning my chair. Out of nowhere, I heard and felt footsteps rushing towards me. The lab is on the 3rd floor of a 4-story building, and the rest of the building is completely unoccupied, and a gust flew past me. I turned to look, and there was no one there. One night, I had this rough dream where my friend came up to me hysterically about his dad being gone and was having a terrible time. It was one of those dreams that looked and felt real, but the moment you wake up, you realize it wasn't true. Fast forward a few hours later, and I was sitting next to the kid I dreamt about, in the same way we always did, before going out to football practice in the 105-degree heat. And for some reason, I turned to help and told him about the dream and described it thoroughly to him. And as I did so, with a stone-cold face, he said to me that today is the 10-year anniversary since his dad left his family. And up until that point, I'd never known anything about his father or when he left his family. It was creepy. I grew up in a 2-family house for the first 10 years of my life. My best friend lived upstairs, and after my family had sold our part of the house to another family and moved, I'd often visit him. One time when visiting, I saw the woman who bought our part of the house and currently lived there at the time. We made small talk, and when she asked me if I remembered seeing a woman in my room, I tell her no, and she tells me that my parents told her about me complaining about a woman in a white dress by my bed when I was a kid. According to her, my parents mentioned it when selling the house. She also tells me that her son is now seeing the same woman and that he's afraid of her. I disregard it and sleep uneasily that night. The next morning I ask my parents about it, and they completely ignore it. They don't say if it's true or untrue, they just say nothing. I'm not sure to this day what happened, but I sure hope that the lady that lived in my old house was joking. My close girlfriends and I went for a few days to my country home during a New Year's. We were 17, 5 in total, and the house is 125 years old and is located on the main road of a small town. The backyard is huge. The way to enter the lot is through 3 front doors, one hard to climb front gate, the gate of an old, not in use wine house that belongs to my grandfather and is connected by another gate to my backyard, and the neighbor's backyard that used to belong to the cousin of the family. For someone who spends her weekends in that home, it isn't creepy at all. I am kind of scared of the backyard, but mostly of the idea of seeing some animal like a mouse or cat or something. My friends felt the unease of being in an old, big country house new to them. So back to the story. My friends and I were in the kitchen preparing dinner or some drinks. I can't remember. So it was already dark. We had music on. We're dancing, having fun, Typical horror movie serial killer target stuff. Then suddenly, we hear a loud bang on the kitchen's wooden window covers. We freak the hell out, turned down the music and just froze looking at each other. The noise came back, followed by a deep manly voice shouting, "Hey." Not creepy, but threatening old man from the countryside, kind of scary. I did not recognize the voice. They all look at me in panic, trying to figure out if I knew what the hell was happening. The living room window covers were open, but we were all too scared to look outside to the backyard, so we decided to close them for protection. Having the voice materialized into a visual threat felt way worse than just leaving it to a hopeful fade. In my mind, in a few seconds, I was trying to think of every non-creepy scenario where what was happening would be logical. Nothing came to me. My only thought was how the hell could anyone have opened a 4-meter metal gate to the wine house and get access to the backyard? And why shout and bang on the windows without saying anything else? That had never happened here. I remember that there were some drug addicts that broke into the wine house trying to find stuff to sell when I was barely a baby. So it could have been something like that. We were all freaking out. They asked me if I knew what was going on, and I couldn't give anything back. I was the host, so I had to do something. I ran to a cabinet where my father stored his hunting shotgun, which I'd never used, and an air pressure gun that uses little lead ammo. I had pretty good training with the second one, so I take that. Although it couldn't kill anyone, shooting the balls or penis would be enough to stop somebody, enabling us to overpower them. This is Portugal, so not many people have guns, and you need a license renovated frequently. And that made me assume that he probably wasn't armed. I was terrified, but adrenaline gave me a helping push, and I started shouting, "Who's out there?" No one answered. I peeked through the living room windows and saw no one. Only the right side of the backyard was visible, not the back itself that leads to the winehouse exit, and I decided it was better to not go outside and wait a bit to see if the creepy man had left. We waited, all scared, trying to make sense of what had happened. We didn't even think of calling the police, and after a while, we were back to fun and music. Even did a little bonfire in the backyard, and tried not to think about it anymore. To this day, I haven't asked my parents who that could have been and why, and still find no possible unreasonable explanation for the deep, hoarse, threatening voice that belonged to no one. This story happened in early December of 2018. It was Christmas break, so I was back home from college and staying with my parents. I live on the second floor of my house, just above the sliding back doors. It's a fairly heavy door, so anytime anyone opens it or closes it, I can hear it. Our house was built in 1940, so it creaks a lot, and sound travels through the walls pretty easily. We live in a relatively safe part of town too. The strangest people we've ever gotten are magazine solicitors, and even they stopped coming around a few years ago. We've never come anywhere close to a break-in. Admittedly, I'd gotten into the bad habit of smoking weed out my bedroom window after my parents went to bed. Most nights by midnight, I had my window open anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours. It depended on how tired I was, how cold it was, as well as other things. I would leave it open to air the room out while I watched Netflix or listened to music. I always listened to whatever I was watching through one headphone. This way, I had an open ear to hear if anyone got up and started walking in the hallway. That night, I had gone through my routine and was laying in bed watching YouTube when the alarm of our house went off. It was this blaring to all hell alarm, so the entire house was up and ready to go. My primary concern, which I realize is ridiculous, was not someone breaking into our house, but that my parents might smell the residual weed smell in my room. My dad poked his head through my door to make sure he knew where I was before he scoped the downstairs and turned off the alarm. When he knew I was okay, he asked me to go into his room with my mum. I don't think he noticed that my room's window was open. After he cleared the downstairs, he did a sweep of the front and backyard to make sure no one was hiding in the shadows. He's pretty paranoid about most things, but honestly, I appreciated his thoroughness. He came back up, told us he didn't find anything, and we all went back to bed. I went back to my room and debated whether or not I should close my window. Stupidly, I decided not to. I figured my dad had swept the yard, so it was fine. Plus, my parents were awake, and I would probably freak out if they heard my window sliding closed. I decided to wait a bit and let them get a little less conscious before making any window-related noises. About 15 minutes later, just as I was about to get up and close my window, the alarm goes off again. My dad rushes downstairs to turn it off, just as I slide my window closed and push both locks back in place. A few minutes pass, and my dad comes knocking on my door. I open it and he tells me, "Hey, I think it's just the wind. Don't worry about the alarm." It had been a pretty windy night, and the door had a little give in its locking mechanism, i.e., it could be pulled about half an inch before you felt the lock, so we decided to write it off for the time being. The next morning, my dad decides to check the alarm systems app on his phone. To our horror, it showed the door being opened and closed 14 times before the alarm triggered. Like I said, it's a heavy door. We've had windier nights and never had the alarm triggered or seen the sensor opened and closed 14 times. My dad was telling our neighbor about what happened the night before, trying to figure out if it had actually been the wind. Our neighbor told us that in fact he'd caught someone briefly entering his backyard on his security camera. He told us he'd probably freaked out once he saw the camera and moved onto our house. Just imagining whoever it was standing at our back door right below my open window triggering the alarm, hiding somewhere, and probably watching my dad scope out the backyard and then doing it all over again, while I laid oblivious in my bed, was enough for me to stop smoking my midnight sessions entirely. After this, we had a series of weird events happen at midnight. The next night, a woman rang our doorbell at the stroke of midnight and gave my dad his wallet, which he hadn't recognized had been missing. A few nights earlier, the alarm triggered at the back door again, and then on Christmas Eve I was home alone while my family was at the midnight church service, and the alarm triggered twice back to back in a disturbingly similar time span. At that time, I didn't bother asking which door had been triggered. I didn't want to know. I took away a fairly simple life lesson. Lock your doors, lock your windows, and set your house alarm, even if you think you're safe. I got my dog when I was 12, and she was 6. She was the best dog I will ever own. She passed away in 2013. I miss her every day and cannot talk about her without crying. Even this is making me tear up a little bit. Every once in a while I'll dream about her, and she will always just sit on my lap and I will pet her. Everything around me feels so foggy, but her and I. It feels so real. I can feel her hair and hear her snoring, as she was a pug mix. When I was 15, I tried to end my own life by taking pills, and she kept barking and barking and barking. I made myself throw them up and apologized to her and cried. I tried again with a razor when I was 19, and she didn't stop barking until I stopped and held her, and I tried again last May. It was very surreal. I planned on jumping into the river, and I've never shared this with anyone, by the way. When I got out of my car, I swear I heard her barking. My feet were so incredibly heavy, and I went up to the river anyway. It was full of police and boats because someone had fallen in the night before, and they were looking for his body. I went home, and I'm doing much better now, but I haven't had a dream visit from her since that night. She sat in my lap again, and I woke up crying but feeling calm. I really do miss her. So my grandparents have had this house since 1974, and have always felt a strange presence in the home, according to what they've told me. I'm 17 years old and have also always felt a strange presence, like a dark energy in the house, since a very young age. In 2010, my grandparents' son, my uncle, ended his own life in the house. Before he did this though, he had tried to do the same thing in his teen years and ended up going blind after not being successful. He'd had a rough life, but he seemed like he was always very happy, and my 8-year-old self had no idea what had happened when I found out that he had passed. After that, the house became increasingly more active. Footsteps at night, shadows across walls, and things being misplaced. When we know, we put them somewhere else. Things got bad quickly. This lasted until we had a priest come and bless the house in 2011, and it seemingly stopped. Nothing happened anymore until recently. And then things have gotten strange again. I made a bad mistake and taunted the entities and put my hand on a lamp near me as I was doing it. Sparks flew up from the lamp, and I was pretty terrified, as that's never happened before. Most of my recent experiences were just last week. I was up at around 3 a.m. when everyone was asleep. I was on the family computer trying to get work done when I heard 3 or 4 loud footsteps and turned to where the noise was coming from and saw a shadow figure moving across the wall. I checked from where it came from, and no one was there. Everyone was asleep in the house except me. I was obviously freaked out a little, but continued on doing work because it didn't bother me too much. My grandmother is absolutely certain something is watching her at night, and she claims she heard a growl when she was in the kitchen one time late at night. My grandfather dismisses everything she says and always tries to come up with a natural explanation for it. Here I am today, just wanting to know other people's opinion on what you think of my creepy situation. This past New Year's Eve, I went away for the night with my 2 best friends and one of their mums. I was home for the holidays from college, and my friend Sarah invited me to go to Palm Springs to celebrate New Year's with her mum and our friend Rachel. I didn't have any other plans, so I decided to go with them. We went to a cool city about an hour from where we live that is big on shopping and resorts. We planned to have a pretty calm night, watch the ball drop at a block party thing downtown, and have a few drinks at a bar. Since we're on the West Coast, the ball drop is at 9, so around 8 we ventured from our hotel, walked to the block party about a mile away, and on the way we passed a very lively bar. We decided to stop by and spent 15 minutes dancing, but didn't get any drinks. It was a gay bar, and Sarah and Rachel, being gay, were stoked on it and wanted to come back after the ball dropped, even though it was about 90% men there. We continue on to the block party, get some dinner, a glass of champagne, and the ball dropped, and they had a DJ. So we spent about an hour in there dancing. After we got tired of it, we opted to head back to the bar and hang out there until midnight. Once we get there, Sarah's mum pays for a drink for each of us, but leaves soon after that as she was tired. It being 10:30 at this point, and Sarah and Rachel and I are enjoying our drinks and having fun. Rachel tried some of my drink, since it was one she hadn't tried before. I constantly have my guard up when drinking in public, and I felt safe at this bar because it was 90% gay men, who I thought would have no interest in me. I went back to the bar to get a second drink, and that's the last thing I remember. The rest I've gathered from Sarah and Rachel. Almost immediately after getting my second drink, I asked Rachel to go to the bathroom with me because I wasn't feeling well, even though I was feeling fine not 10 minutes previously. Once in the bathroom, I just collapsed on the floor, and I was almost unresponsive. Rachel, now worried, somehow drags my half-lifeless body out to where Sarah was waiting for us. Security, seeing my condition and assuming I was wasted, asked us to leave. Sarah and Rachel decide to take me back to the hotel, about half a mile away. By this point I was unconscious, and there were barely sounds escaping from my mouth. They saw someone leave the bar at the same time as us who was walking nearby, but they were preoccupied with trying to keep my lifeless body from the ground. And at one point, I threw up all over myself, both of them, and the sidewalk. The next part of the story we had to get from Sarah, and Rachel doesn't have any memory of this part. Still struggling to carry me, the man they saw leave the bar approached them. He was hitting on Rachel, trying to get her to grab a drink with him. She was very agitated and told him to leave. Her friend needed help right now, and he didn't take no for an answer and continued to follow us down the street, asking if they wanted to get drinks with him, if he can help carry me and such. A middle-aged woman witnessing this came up and told the man off, something along the lines of, "Stop harassing these young women or I'm going to call the police," and he left. Next, by some miracle, an EMT and his wife enjoying the holidays ran into us on the street. He checked me out to make sure something wasn't majorly wrong and then carried me the rest of the way to my hotel and into the room, since my friends could barely hold me up. They thanked him profusely and him and his wife left, and this is where Rachel's memory kicks back in. 5 minutes later they get a knock on the door, and it's the EMT and his wife. They came to let us know that a man followed us into the hotel, and they just saw him hop the gate and start to make his way to our room. My friends called hotel security, but they were unable to locate him. My friends didn't get a glimpse of him, but I'm sure it was the same man from earlier. I spent the rest of the night vomiting everything in my body and dry heaving after that. I woke up next morning in a pile of pillows and blankets on the bathroom floor. My last memory was at the bar getting a second drink, and my friends filled me in on everything that happened. Feeling like crap. I thought I must have drunk way too much, but I'd never blacked out before in my life, and the amount of drink I had didn't add up to me being completely unconscious. We decided my first drink had to have been drugged, since Rachel had some of it and had no memory of our walk home, even though she was fully functional. I'm sure that man that was talking to Rachel and then followed us back was the one that slipped something into my drink. To this day, I don't really know how I could have been slipped something. I got my drink from the bar and never set it down. My best guess was that it was already in the cup. Thankfully, I had good friends and kind strangers protecting me that night. It keeps me up at night thinking what could have happened under different circumstances. This happened around Christmas time, when I was around 7. I was looking for my dad to ask him for something, so naturally, I went straight to my parents' bedroom. I have a huge family, 8 in total, 5 siblings, myself, and my parents, and we lived in a small house. Before going into my parents' bedroom, I saw my siblings out in the living room and also the front yard, and my mum was in the kitchen, so I assumed my dad must be in the bedroom. I walked down the hallway to their room, and the door was wide open. There's nothing strange in here, but then I heard something rustling around in the closet. Ah, he's trying to hide the presents for Christmas, I thought. My parents always hide our Christmas presents in the closet before we set up the tree. So I walk towards the closet door, but still cannot see inside, and the rustling noises start to become more intense, as if clothes were being thrown to the ground. I speak out and say, "Dad?" I get no response. I repeat, "Hey, Dad?" Then I hear the most cynical and unfamiliar voice I've ever encountered say, "What?" If you were to imagine a demon talking to you, that's what it sounded like. That's the only way I can describe how this voice sounded. It scared me out of my mind because I knew that my dad did not sound like that. So I ran to the front of the house. I see my siblings still playing in the living room and outside. My mum is still in the kitchen, and then my dad walks in from the garage. I still have no idea who or what responded to me from my parents' closet. My brother and I shared a very old house here in a small mountain town in Colorado. Sadly though, my brother has since passed. The entire house was severely out of date and drab. It was an odd layout, and the basement, well, that's a whole different story. But the whole house seemed to vibrate with dark vibes and energy. The lamps and overhead lights never seemed to brighten the rooms enough to make you feel comfortable. I've had many friends and a few boyfriends comment on the creepy presence of the outside and the physical difference the house gave off when you were inside it. I have had countless seemingly unexplained happenings that could go on all night, but for now, this is the creepiest. My brother passed away in the house in 2011. His girlfriend in 2009, and 2 dogs died in the house before I finally moved out. This story is about my brother's first dog, Duke, who passed away first. He was an elderly black mixed dog, sweet as could be, and always on my side. The other dog was Gunner, a black lab that was much younger than Duke. Well, the day came that Duke died of old age. He walked into my room with his swollen tongue and dropped to the floor and took his last struggling breaths in my bedroom. We were all very sad, of course, and life went on. My brother's bedroom and mine were right next to each other at the end of a long hallway, with a bathroom to the side of the kitchen and living room at the end of the hallway. One night, I came out of bed, opened my door into the dark hallway, and proceeded down the long hallway to the kitchen. Gunner usually sits at my brother's doorframe to keep an observing eye on my brother and myself, and the happenings of the house. So when I started down the hallway into the dark, I heard and felt Gunner trot down the hallway from behind me, swipe my seat pant leg as he trotted by, and I heard him make his way to the kitchen. I get to the light switch at the end of the hall, and to my surprise, there is Gunner completely passed out on the couch under a blanket. That was not the Gunner who ran past me, and it still gives me chills remembering this story. My aunt, who was like my second mum, died suddenly when I was 3. Even though she was young, we were close, and I still remember her very well. A few years after she died, I was sleeping in my mum's bed and woke up for some reason. Lying across from me, I saw my aunt looking at me and smiling. I remember it so vividly. She had this white glow coming off her, and she was outlined in gold. It was amazing. I remember she gave me a hug and told me that it was going to be okay and to go back to sleep. It was so peaceful when I closed my eyes, and I woke up in the morning and she was gone. I told my mum, and she said Auntie probably paid me a visit. It was surreal. It was Christmas Eve, and I was a freshman in high school. My family had been split up for some time, so normally we'd trade off Christmas Day and Christmas Eve every year. And this year, I had come home early from my grandparents' Christmas party, while everyone else was at my aunt and uncle's celebrating at another party. When I was dropped off, my cousins offered to stay with me for a few hours, but I declined. I thought I could watch some of my new DVDs and get some alone time in the house, which is a rarity. I had noticed an unfamiliar car parked on the street, but didn't think anything of it, considering it was Christmas Eve and probably a neighbor's relatives or something. After I got inside and locked the door, grabbed snacks and started to settle down. I hadn't been home for more than 15 minutes when there was a knock at the door. I unlocked the door and opened it a crack to see a man standing there. Dark hair, glasses, slightly overweight, and dressed casually. He didn't look like much of a threat, but my stomach dropped and he asked, "I was wondering about the car. Is it for sale?" I told him I didn't think so. "Is there someone here I can talk to it about?" I said, and quite stupidly, "No, you can come back at another time," and shut the door and turned the lock as fast as I possibly could. He reached for the handle immediately and started pounding on the door. I heard a string of profanities and the pounding stopped. Terrified, I was crawling on the floor to the phone, hoping he wouldn't be able to see me through one of the windows. Then I heard the noises. Our house had an open garage door, and it led through to the laundry room, where the door lock was broken and no one had bothered to fix it. Just then I heard a man yell, and I saw the man through the window run to his car and drive off. My uncle had gotten him just in time and scared the man off. Who knew what would have happened if he hadn't have made it home in time? Sadly, we didn't get the number plate, and nothing ever came of it. But I'll never be home alone on a holiday again. My wonderful wife worked in an assisted living home for many years. She became very close to her residents and was somehow connected to many of them. One Friday evening, we were at a restaurant having our date night dinner, and she suddenly straightened up, put her hand on her throat and said, "Oh no, John, no." I asked her what was wrong. "John, he just died." And then a moment later she said, "Oh no, don't do that. Let him go." I wrote down the time, consoled her and went home. She called work. John had died at the exact time she reacted, 10 miles away, and they had to perform CPR because he did not have a DNR order on file, and brought him back, breaking his sternum as usual, and he finally died in my wife's arms 2 days later. I'd always wondered about my wife's psychic abilities. I've learned through the years not to question them, but this time was the first I ever got solid proof. She's a special lady, and I'm very lucky to have been married to her for 32 years. It was New Year's Eve, and myself and 2 of my friends were out the front of my house listening to music on my iPod. We were about 12 at the time, and there was no one else around. It was probably 10:30 at night, and we were waiting for the illegal fireworks to light up down the street, as this happened every year. It probably sounds a little weird, 12-year-old kids alone at 10:30 p.m. listening to Katy Perry in the middle of the street, but it wasn't too unusual. See, my neighborhood is very close. We know the neighbors really well, so our parents, who were in the house, and ourselves weren't all that concerned. We were listening to Hot and Cold by Katy Perry, and we were jamming along to it when we began to hear a whistle. First off, it sounded like it was part of the song, so I initially ignored it, but that was until it started to distort and go out of the rhythm. It didn't seem to be in tune with the song, and it was eerily out of pitch. I don't know why, maybe to hear it better, but my friend decided to pause the music. As soon as the music stopped, the whistling persisted, pitchy and slow. We were a little bit spooked. It was dark outside. Other than the few street lights on the road, we couldn't really see much or make much out of the darkness, other than the strange whistling. We were able to pinpoint the direction it was coming from soon enough, though. We turned towards it and froze. About 10 meters from where we stood, just on the edge of the street lamp's light, was a man. He looked disheveled, likely homeless, and was standing there looking at us, whistling that pitchy whistle. We were all frozen for a while and caught off guard, until my fight or flight kicked in. I yelled at my friends to get inside, and they began to scream and run up the driveway. I pushed and shoved them forward, terrified because I didn't know whether they could hear what I was hearing. But the whistling had finally stopped, but something else was drowning out the silence. Heavy footsteps settled. He was chasing after us. I screamed bloody murder, opened the front door, and shoving them inside, not caring if I hurt them, I turned to slam the deadbolt on as he reached the screen door. I watched his figure come into view. He was dirty, wearing soiled long-sleeved clothes, and had an unkempt beard and wore a torn beanie. As I closed the door, he stopped just ahead of the screen, looked at me dead in the eyes and murmured something that still makes my skin crawl. Damn it. One of my friends consoled the other, who was now in tears, and I watched him through the peephole. He lingered for a second more, then disappeared into the blackness. I remember my friend grabbing me and asking me if I was okay, and then pointed down to my hands. I was shaking like a leaf. We never told our parents. When I was about 2, my grandfather died. I was too young to remember, but I heard stories about how he adored me, and he loved me tirelessly. I'd visit him or he would visit me almost every day. He sometimes refused to let my dad hold or play with me until the visit was over. He loved me very much. After he passed, our dog went nuts. Before we even found out about his passing, our dog Casey became very violent, and my mum was forced to put him down. He was attacking people, and she was afraid for me since I was so little. The dog was also low before it happened. It was really weird. A few days after he passed, my mum put me to bed, cleaned up my room, and put my toys in the closet. The door was closed, and I was in my crib asleep when she left the room. She swears to this day that she heard me babbling from my crib and it was non-stop. She came back upstairs, and I was somehow sitting on the floor with the closet door wide open staring at it. She asked who I was talking to and I said, "Bampa," and she was very freaked out. When I turned 5, I lost Piggy. He was a stuffed little pig that I'd play with, and I took him everywhere I went. I went to bed with him, woke up with him, and one day when I awoke he was gone, and nobody could find him anywhere. I cried for days, but there was nowhere that he could have gone missing either. It was very strange, and my sister kept telling me that Grandpa took him. And the final piece that I personally remember that still freaks me out. I was 7 and woke up in the middle of the night wanting a glass of water. I didn't want to wake my parents, so I left the lights off, and as I made my way downstairs, I took a hard slip and was about to smash my face against the bottom, when all of a sudden I feel something or someone catch me. It was like floating down the stairs, slowly. When my feet hit the floor at the bottom of the stairs, I snapped back to reality. I know this wasn't a dream, because I vividly remember running back up the stairs to try and replicate what happened, and nothing did. I never told anyone for fear of being made fun of and people thinking I'm crazy, but I suspected it was Grandpa. And to top it all off, about 6 months ago I visited my mum, and we got on the subject of my grandpa. I then told her about the stories from the first time, and she went white as a ghost. My sister had similar experiences when we were younger. This was a few years after my story happened, but still, and she did tell my mum. She was also caught and put in a terrace after almost falling down the stairs, floating until safe. I was never aware, and she didn't know my story either. You wouldn't believe any of this, but my family swears by it, and it's the only real paranormal experience I can recall. Thanks, Grandpa Lou, for looking out for us. 2 years ago on Christmas Eve, a friend of mine died in a car accident. His sister was driving with him to their dad's house as the parents are divorced, and his car hit an ice patch, slid, and got hit by an oncoming car. His sister was seriously injured and has since made a full recovery, but he passed away. This absolutely ruined me, and I had to go to therapy for a while. About 6 months later, I started hearing a metal chiming sort of noise when I laid in bed at night. I thought it was coming from my brother's room, which is right next to mine, because he's a swimmer and has tons of medals hung on a shelf with pegs. I thought somehow his fan or something was making them hit each other. So I went to his room, but they were totally still. Mind you, it's 1 a.m. when this happened, and he was fast asleep. This continued for months, at least 3 times a week, and always at night between 1 to 3 in the morning. I'd hear chiming, go into his room, or check around mine, and could never find out where it was coming from. I'm embarrassed to say that it was beginning to scare me. I eventually decided to buy a sage bundle and sage the house. I felt crazy doing it, and it's embarrassing to admit that I even did do it, but it totally worked. The chiming completely stopped for months and never came back. I recently told this story to a very religious and spiritual friend, and she told me that good spirits will never try to scare you, and it was possibly my friend that passed, trying to let me know that he was well. After this, I felt bad for saging the house and being scared. I decided to say something like, "Hey, I know it's you who are making the bell sounds, and I'm not scared anymore. I'd love another sign from you." And they started up again. Every now and then, when I'm laying in bed about to fall asleep, I'll hear a few isolated chimes, then gentle and sound like a quiet bell. I always smile and feel at peace, and I love hearing it. Ghosts and spirits are often portrayed as bad and scary things, but I don't feel that way. It's honestly helped me heal a lot from his loss. I know I sound like a nut job, but I truly believe it's his spirit, letting me know that it's all right. This is my friend's story. Her dad ended his own life when he was in college. Her uncle, her dad's brother, and her dad were in a huge fight, to the point of not speaking to each other. The uncle felt super guilty about being on bad terms when his brother did that. Fast forward to a few months later. It was 3 a.m. and her uncle got a phone call from a random number. He realized after a few moments that it was his brother's old cell phone number, and he immediately called the number back. A very groggy woman answered the other line. He tells her that she just called him, and she swears up and down that she did not. She even checked her recent calls, and the uncle's number didn't show. They were both pretty freaked out, but they hung up. Fast forward a few months later, the same thing happens. This time the uncle doesn't call her back. He just decides to go to the next day to the AT&T to block the number from calling him. So the next day he goes in and tells them the story. The employee all of a sudden gets really quiet and sort of pale, and proceeds to tell my uncle that a few months ago, when the first phone call happened, the woman was so scared by his story, she asked for a different phone number. The phone number now belongs to no one and had been disconnected for months. They think that it was my dad's way of telling his brother that he forgave him. They still have no explanation as to why the number called my uncle in the first place, though. When I was 13, the dawning of a new millennium took place on New Year's Eve. While people were fearing the worst with the Y2K bug, or out partying and drinking, I was home alone. In 1996, my parents had split up, and from there they divorced, and my mother and I moved across the country from Oregon to Tennessee with her best friend. On the eve of the year 2000, I was home alone, and my mother was currently out of state. Now, this didn't worry me, as this was not the first time. I often came home to find a note on the kitchen counter saying that she had gone to Florida for a few days and that there were some groceries in the fridge. Since the divorce, she was regularly leaving me alone for long periods of time to go to Florida. We lived on a relatively quiet road, surrounded by trees, and set a few miles out of town. And I know most of the people, if not by name, then by face, well enough to wave and have small chats with, and have never been given a reason to be afraid of being alone. On the night in question, I was staying up late watching television. I remember that I was watching the movie His Bodyguard on USA Channel, and had most of the lights on in the house, not because I was afraid, but because at 13, I wasn't concerned with electricity bills or saving the environment. I felt completely safe and protected within the confines of my bubble of home. As I was watching the movie, I kept hearing these weird sounds outside, but I remember thinking it was likely just the neighbors. Though they weren't extremely close, a couple of them were having a party, and about halfway into the movie, the power in the house suddenly went dead. I sat on the couch for a minute, just sort of in a panic daze because it was near midnight and pitch black. I remember thinking the power must have gone out and that it would come back on in a while, so I decided to sit on the couch with my blanket and wait. A few minutes passed by when I heard a noise in the kitchen, where the back door is. My heart started racing in my chest, because I thought it sounded like the back door being shut. The back door sits just off the dining room, which is connected to the kitchen, which leads directly into the living room, where I was currently sitting on the couch. A few seconds passed after I heard the sound, and I was straining my ears to pick up anything that wasn't supposed to be there. Every noise suddenly felt magnified. When footsteps sounded, I immediately slithered off the couch onto all fours and crawled around the ottoman, and started, as slowly and as quietly as I could, to make my way towards the space between the love seat and the couch. I knew I could fit under the side table and be completely hidden by the dark and the ottoman. From playing hide and seek in the dark many times with my friends during sleepovers, I knew this was a good hiding spot. I was nearly there when the footsteps became more pronounced. I knew from the sound of them that whoever it was making their way through the kitchen now towards the living room. They weren't hurried or anything. It was like they were just moving around in the kitchen. I glanced up from where I was crouched on the floor, and to my horror, there was a dark silhouette standing in the archway between the two doors. To my credit, I didn't scream, however I did panic. I stood immediately to my feet from my hiding spot and ran down the hallway, and I believe the only reason I wasn't overcome was because the person chasing me had to get around the ottoman in the dark to follow me. I did what all children do when they're afraid, and I bypassed the front door, the guest bedroom, the bathroom, and ran to the farthest door down the hallway. My room. In all honesty, I probably wouldn't have been able to get to the front door, unlock it, and open it in time, as it was right off the side of the couch. When I was 10, I got a bird for my birthday. He was a blue-fronted Amazon, and I called him Boo, because it was October and close to Halloween. Boo had a large iron cage. It could have been metal, but it was very large and sturdy, at least 6 feet tall, and that it was always kept in my room. Despite the fact that Boo, like me, pretty much had run of the house whenever he wanted, this information will become relevant later. As I run into the room, I slammed the door shut and locked it. However, the lock was simply one of those little turn knobs that you could easily pop with a coin or butter knife. I had barely gotten the door shut and locked when the person on the other side knocked on it. I have no idea why they knocked, if they did it to mock me or scare me, but I knew in my heart that my little lock was not going to keep whoever it was on the other side out of my room. It didn't keep my mother out when we were arguing, and it wouldn't stand up to brute force. I was panicking, on the verge of tears when the person began to laugh. It was a low, quiet laugh, which made it even more frightening. It wasn't like manic laughter, but as if they were genuinely amused. It was the laughter that really frightened me, and I started crying heavily and hysterically, and looked around the room for anything I could do. That's when I realized Boo's cage would fit almost perfectly between the door and the wall of my closet. The cage moved quietly on my carpeted floor, but as I pushed it into place, it scraped against the door and alerted whoever was on the other side that I was attempting to barricade myself in, because suddenly they threw themselves at my door, and you could hear the sound of the wood splintering and the door handle being twisted violently. Boo, who had been stirred by the movements, awoke and literally began to scream and flap his wings. I might have screamed with him, but I don't remember doing so, and just remember this terrified and extreme fear overcome me. I crawled under my bed, which is a bunk bed with a futon on the bottom, and several minutes passed and the person eventually stopped attacking my door. Boo continued screaming even after he had stopped. Though being under my bed, it gave me no feelings of being secure. I didn't come out from under it because I had nowhere else to go. I thought about trying to go to the window, but I was too afraid he might be there, expecting me on the other side. Not to mention it was also several feet until I hit the ground, as the house was built on a raised foundation. I remember laying under my bed terrified for hours. I must have fallen asleep because I woke up the next day at daylight. The fear of what happened came back to me as soon as I registered where I was and why, and scared that whoever has been in my house might still be there. I decided to crawl out the window and run to a neighbor's since it was daylight outside, and therefore I felt less afraid. Crawling out is a lot harder than it looks. Once I was back on my feet, however, I carefully made my way around the house, and that's when I noticed the back door was wide open. Scared but feeling braver than I was, as I was now outside, and it was not pitch black, I walked up the back steps and peered inside. Seeing nothing out the ordinary, I decided to go in. Looking back, I cringe on how stupid this must have turned out, and that I wish I could have told my younger self to make the smarter move and grab help. But thankfully no one was in the house. I did a terrifying heart-pounding room-to-room check, looking in closets and under beds, behind the couch and anywhere. I thought even a small child might be able to fit. I even popped the locks on my mum's bedrooms so I could check it and then re-locked it. And that's when I noticed that the breaker box on the opposite wall was open. The main switch had been pulled. I flipped it back on, locked both locks on the back door, checked all the windows and front doors, and then called my mum, where I once again broke down crying hysterically. She called a co-worker who came and stayed the entire day with me as they drove back. My mum still takes random trips to Florida after that, but I always went with her from then going forward. So terrified, laughing, crazy person that broke into my house on New Year's Eve. Please, let's never meet again. Me and my mother were in the same dream. Sort of. You see, in my dream, I saw my deceased grandmother, and she and I were talking at a room in our house, located on the second floor. I can't remember what exactly we were talking about, but I remember I was asking for forgiveness for something. I sense that there are other relatives waiting outside the door, as if they're lining up to talk to my grandmother also. But it was not a sad mood. It felt festive, in fact, like one of her parties, as she loved to entertain when she was alive. I remember that I recognized people at the party, old relatives like my grandmother that were already dead. I didn't tell my mum about it because she's superstitious and all, and she likes to make a big deal out of these things. But 2 days later, as we were eating breakfast, she told me that she dreamt of her mother-in-law, my grandmother, and here's where the part gets weird. In her dream, she was outside of her house, and she knew that there was a gathering inside, like a party. She caught a glimpse of my grandmother and our dead relatives at the gathering. She knew there was a party inside, and she refused to enter the house, thinking in her dream that she didn't belong there. If she had decided to come in, would she have found me inside? It creeped both of us out. The coincidence was uncanny. It wasn't as if we talked about my grandmother in recent times that might have triggered the dream. What's more creepy was that she didn't even know about my dream, and yet in 2 consecutive nights, we managed to dream about the almost same event. It's New Year's Eve, and after a wild night of kisses and body shots, I'm outright dead. I crawled into my buddy's bed alone at about 2 a.m. and had the greatest 20-minute sleep of my life. I wake up to the sound of a constant thumping and cracking noise. Every other second I hear a thump, then silence. I slowly get out of his bed and creep across the bedroom. The plan was that only him and I would be staying over, and although I found a few various people nestled on couches, the bathtub, or just motionless on the floor, nothing was out of place. I couldn't find the source of the constant drumming until I was in his basement at ground level and facing the corner of the room. My hand touched the wall's corner, still hearing constant thumping from the other side. It was coming from the inside of the wall. I stood back maybe a few inches and just stared. That's when the tip of an axe breaks clean through the wall. I screamed out and heard my friend rushing down the stairs. I'm frozen in panic against the opposite wall when he blew through the door. He sees the axe wiggling back through the wall, then crashing again through it, sending splinters across the floor. He grabs a shovel and we fly out the back door, turning the corner of the house to confront the axe-wielding psycho. What we found was an axe stuck firmly into the side of the house, with nobody around. We did a few laps of his house and found no traces of the mysterious midnight lumberjack. Freakiest thing I've ever experienced. The axe lodged in the side of the house now sits in his basement in a closed footlocker, waiting for its owner to come back and claim it. My aunt raised me after my mother died, and for the last 4 years after her own death, I'm convinced she was trying to contact me. I've heard my name whispered in the middle of the night. I've been touched several times. I've woken up to find blankets that were folded up on the chair in my room to be placed over me. I've heard someone walking in my house when I'm alone, and my dog is cuddled next to me. Someone who was house-sitting asked if there was a blonde woman that lived near me, as they had seen her silently standing in the yard when they came to feed my pets. My aunt was blonde, but my neighbors are not. What needs to be understood is that it was very sudden and quick when my aunt passed. She was unconscious and drifting towards death before she even knew what was happening. We were also very codependent on each other, and we did everything together, lived together, watched TV together. She was my best friend, and I wasn't able to be there when she passed, as she died while I was on the way, and never got to say goodbye. Now, as I've seen so many horror movies before all this, it could be a demon trying to mess with my heartstrings and eat my soul. But who knows? Maybe she's just watching over me. It's Christmas Eve 1990, and as a tradition, I always slept in my brother's room, because the door to the attic was in my room. Excited to see what Santa had brought me, I quickly went to sleep. In the middle of the night, the sounds of the closet door in my brother's room opening woke me up, and as I opened my eyes, there stood a tall man dressed in dark-colored clothes, just walking past me. Though I should have been scared out my mind, I wasn't, and I felt at ease and comfortable, like I knew him, though this was the only time I had ever seen him, as he passed through the door leading out of my brother's room and onto the upstairs landing that connected our 2 rooms and a bathroom. I jumped up to follow him, but as I got to the landing, he was no longer there. I looked to the bathroom and in my room, but nothing was there. Then I heard something down the stairs, so I looked over the balcony to the living room, down the stairs, and it was dark. But I could make out the fact our Santa gifts had been delivered in the glow of the Christmas lights, and figured I had almost gotten caught by Santa. So I excitedly woke my brother up, and like 2 normal kids on Christmas, we ran downstairs and excitedly woke up my mum and dad. It took a few days before the memory of what woke me up came back to me, and it took years before I ever told anyone about it. One day, me and my mum just happened to be talking about ghosts and things like that, when I told her the story of that Christmas Eve in 1990. And as I described the man to her, she smiled and showed me this really old black and white photo of a man standing next to a horse and plow. It was the man I had seen. Turns out everyone in the family had seen him, but hadn't told me because I was young, and they didn't want to scare me. The man in the picture was my mum's granddad, and he had passed away before either me and my brother had been born. My first experience of the paranormal, and it was family, explains why I was never scared. Here I am some 28 years later, and I can still remember that night like it were yesterday. I'm from Texas, and was planning on moving to Ohio to live with my mum. But before I moved, she told me that when she was in the house one time by herself at midday, that she heard a growl come from upstairs. She said she ran upstairs yelling and checking all the rooms. I honestly thought she was joking, but about a month later I moved in and started school. So there were times I was home by myself and everything was just normal. I hadn't heard anything, so I started to think she was just full of it, and scared because she was by herself with the accompaniment of her boyfriend every now and then. I just finished a study sesh at the library at around 7:30, and my mum said she was working late. By the time I got home it was 7:45, and during winter the sun was already set. I went inside. Only the kitchen light was on, and I began eating a snack while leaning against the counter. I looked towards the dining room where it was dark and started to feel uneasy. So I went to go turn on the light as I was walking back, and I passed the stairs, and it sounded like someone was running down them. So I assumed it was the neighbors or the house settling. Then I started walking past the couch and heard heavy breathing, like if someone literally just got through running a marathon. I decide to ignore it and go back to the kitchen to finish my snack. As soon as I lean against the counter, something growled at me from the other side of the wall. I stopped what I was doing, and I was slightly peeking around the corner, and it growled at me again, but louder this time. I ran out to my car and sat in it watching the house for the next 2 hours until my mum came home. I told her what happened, and she believed me, but her boyfriend just laughed to my face. It's been a good 7 months, and we've heard the growl twice since then, and have felt an awfully dark energy towards the area of the dining and living room. This happened on New Year's Eve 2004. I was a good kid. I didn't drink until I was legally old enough, so what happened can't be put down to alcohol. I had been to a New Year's Eve party at a friend's house while her parents were out. When her parents returned, we left them to it and moved the party to another friend's house. Around 5 a.m. I decided to call it a night and make my way back home. I walked for 20 minutes before getting to the stage where I had to walk under a motorway. Just to let you know, you cross the bridge and you're under the motorway. So it's essentially an open tunnel with lots of thick pillars. It goes on for quite a while, as there are 3 roads that it crosses underneath. The first is right at the start, the second 200 meters up, and the final one 300 meters beyond that point. The final one is right at the end where I come out and walk up my street. Just behind the final road is a street light and a working men's club. Now, I had seen a few people scattered about, so when I came to cross to the second road and saw a figure up ahead under the streetlight, I didn't bat an eyelid, especially with the working men's club behind it. As I got closer, I realized the figure was a girl wearing a fancy dress. She has a costume that would have fitted somewhere between 1900s to 1920s. It was a light color, but our street lights are orange, so everything was disguised by the orange glow, and I couldn't say for certain what color it was. She was standing looking to her right up the road into what could have been oncoming traffic. I remember thinking that she was wearing odd clothes for this time of year, but each to their own, and I stared at her right until I was standing directly opposite, the other side of the final road. I looked left and looked right and crossed the road, and by the time I reached the other side, the girl was gone. No cars had passed. There was nothing behind that she could have gone to without me seeing, and I looked away from her for about 2 seconds. What happened to that girl? I worked in a movie theater when I was 17. On my first day, everyone was joking around about how the theater was haunted and trying to scare me. Sometime during this, the manager at the time goes upstairs to talk on the phone with her fiancé, as it's a really chilled out workplace. Our theater had 4 screens and a long dark hallway. There was a dark room with 4 old school projectors, and she was sitting on a desk that we used whenever a movie would inevitably mess up and the film would break. This desk was between projectors 2 and 3 on the opposite wall. About 5 minutes later, as we're all standing in concessions goofing off, we hear her running down the stairs. We turn to see why she's running, and she has this confused and angry sort of look on her face and asked us who went upstairs. At this point we were all confused since nobody had left concessions at all, and she says she was chatting with her fiancé when she saw something out of the corner of her eye. She turns and sees the calves/feet of someone wearing blue jeans and white tennis shoes crawl behind projector 4, directly in front of the stairs. She told her fiancé she thought one of us was trying to scare her, so she walked over to find no one. The only people wearing jeans were myself, since I didn't have my khakis yet, and another guy I had been talking to the whole time this took place. Still gives me the chills, and lots of weird stuff has happened there. This all happened Tuesday night. My significant other Kyle and I went to an absolutely fantastic concert for New Year's Eve. We met up with a few friends, but they all left right after midnight. The bands were great, so we wanted to stay for the rest of the show. Kyle got a call from a good friend, Nathan, at around 1 a.m. Nathan said that he was at the same bar and wanted to know if we were still there. We were stoked because Nathan never gets out the house. He's a super cool guy and we love hanging out with him, and he had a girlfriend with him who I like a lot, and his friend Derek. I don't like Derek at all. Derek just gives off a creepy vibe. He talks slow and monotone, and he stares for too long and leans in too close. He is Nathan's pity friend. They were best friends for a long time, and Derek's family did a lot for Nathan during a rough patch. Nathan will bring him along every now and again because he feels obligated to at this point, but he has no trust in him whatsoever. Derek is a drug addict. Anyway, we all hang out and have some laughs. Derek sits there being all freaky as usual, just staring at everyone. When he would speak, it would be something off the wall and completely unrelated to anything anyone was talking about. Once he looked at Dawn and I and said, "I think it'd be really weird if you two made out." Okay, yeah, it would be weird. We ignored that and kept on having fun. The bar closed, and Kyle asked them if they wanted to come to our house and have some more drinks and play foosball and Tekken. I was a little annoyed because he didn't okay this with me first, and I was ready for bed. I wasn't that upset though. I know that Kyle just likes to have company, and I told him I wouldn't mind if it was just Nathan and Dawn, as I didn't want Derek in our house, and I don't trust him. Kyle brushed it off and says, "What's the worst that can happen? It'll be fine, he's just weird. Well, when we're all leaving, we had to wait for Derek in the parking lot for the longest time. Turns out he was waiting outside the door of the bar and trying to get any girl to come with him, bribing them with free pills. I got mad and said, "What makes you think it's okay to invite random people into my house?" He just laughed. We get to my house and he sits on the couch by me. He keeps poking me, and when I ask him what he wants, he stares for 10 seconds before saying, "What's up?" I started ignoring him. He continued to poke me and tickle my feet, and I wouldn't even look over. Then he starts getting phone calls from people asking for pills. I went to the bathroom and he tried to follow me in there. I pushed him out, locked the door, and he knocked. After this, he starts trying to get Nathan and Dawn to take him home, which was 45 minutes away, and it's 4 a.m. They tell him no way. They had agreed he was staying with them, and they actually wanted to go to their house and sleep in their own bed 10 minutes away. He didn't want to go to their house. He wanted to go home or stay at our place. He started whining and telling me that I had to convince them to stay. I told him no. So he began saying Dawn had too much to drink to drive. The girl had 1 beer the entire night. When they were getting ready to leave, Derek comes back in and says he needs to use the restroom. Kyle is overly trusting of people and doesn't pay attention to the weird behavior, but I'm the opposite, so I keep an eye on dodgy Derek. I caught him going through my prescription bottles. They were nothing but antibiotics, but it pissed me off that he was trying to steal from us, and I told him he needed to leave immediately. He then stood in our kitchen refusing to leave, staring at us, and I said that they were waiting on him and that he needed to go now. "Don't you remember the time I gave you guys a ride? Well, make it even. You either convince them to stay or I'll stay here and y'all take me home." No way. He gave us a ride home when we had a flat once, and we lived 2 blocks apart at the time. We weren't going 45 minutes away to take a weirdo home that's refusing to leave for unknown reasons. He kept saying that Dawn was drunk, and Kyle speaks up and says, "If you get in a roadblock, I'll come to get you." And he says, "Well, are you gonna post the bail too? Because we're your responsibility now." I'm beyond frustrated at this point and told Kyle, "You invited them, now get rid of him." And I went to sit on the couch. Derek continued to stand there and stare at Kyle. Kyle, normally passive, is getting angry and telling him it's time for him to go and that we aren't taking him home or convincing anyone to stay. Derek says that he's not leaving, so he has to do one or the other. Kyle finally went outside and got Nathan to come, literally dragged Derek to the car, and the next morning Nathan called and asked if we were missing an iPhone, because Derek mysteriously has one now. Yes, in fact, my old iPhone was missing from the drawer. It was off, and I'd rather just let Derek keep it than communicate with him further. Nathan has apologized profusely and says that he isn't bringing Derek around anymore. My grandparents have a big house in England, due to my granddad having a lot of sad money. By sad money, I mean he got it from inheritance because most of his family died off when he was young, leaving him to retire early. Before I was born, it's where the majority of my family stayed. My granddad, step-grandma, 4 uncles, black Labrador, and my mum. So a very busy house. This house wasn't too old when my granddad bought it, maybe 20 years old, and it didn't look freaky. In fact, it looked quite modern for an English house. For quite a while, everything was alright, until the first incident happened. The first incident wasn't scary. Frankly, it could have been a prank done by any of the family. It started off in the smallest room, known as the kids' room. There was a lock on the outside of the door to prevent the dog getting in, as this door was easy for him to push open. Every time a family member, no matter who, would be locked in after they enter. This meant they wouldn't be able to unlock the door as they were on the inside. Most times they would call out and bang on the door until someone came, but sometimes there would be no one home, and the person on the inside would have to use the landline to call a nearby family member to come home and let them out. Now, my family isn't very superstitious, especially my granddad, who has zero tolerance for anything. So everyone used to blame my mum. I know it's just her word, but she promised the family that even years later it wasn't her. My mom wasn't superstitious until she had to spend the night in this small room, as when she went traveling, one of her brothers took over her room. The second incident occurred over 2 of the nights she slept in that room. She claimed one night she woke up around 1 or 2 a.m. and saw a very tall figure next to the door go out the room. She thought it might have been her eyes not properly adjusting after waking up, so she lay back down and turned to face the wall. She then turned around again, about 10 minutes later, seeing the room much clearer in the dark, and the figure was still there. She thought this time it was one of her brothers, so she called out to them. There was no response, and she started to get angry and turned on her lamp. Nothing appeared next to the door, so she slowly turned off her lamp, a bit shaken up, and went back to sleep. The next night, the same thing happened, but that night she was less anxious and brushed it off, never really talking about it. But on the third night, waking up again, there was nothing. No figure at the door. She thought it was weird, but she didn't really mention it until after I was born and came to stay over one Christmas holiday. This was the third incident. As I was the youngest of around 6, I had to stay in the kids' room. Christmas Eve came, and I woke up at around midnight. I turned around in the bed and noticed a figure at the side of the door that scared me. I covered my face with the duvet and stayed there for 5 minutes. As a child, I was very superstitious, listening to all the rumors of ghosts, so I was too scared to get out of bed and go past it to the door. After those 5 minutes, I decided to face my fears and go to Mum, but when I took my head out of the covers, there was nothing by the door anymore. I came to realize it might be my granddad's, so I brushed it away. This happened until Boxing Day, with occurrence from 12 till 4 in the morning. It became a routine to me and never thought to bring it up with my mum until this year. It was the summer holidays, and I was spending the holidays at home, which is only 10 minutes away from my granddad's house, as I moved about 4 years ago. I decided to visit my cousins who were all staying at my granddad's, and when I got there, my youngest cousin of age 6 came running up to me and said, "Why is there always a man standing by the door at night?" This sent chills running down my spine, and then I began to talk to my mum about it, who then talked to my family. We all ended up having weird experiences in the small room, and ever since have all called it the naughty kids room, to scare the boys, saying if they're bad, they'll have to go into that room at night, and we'll make the strange man come out. Let's just say my cousins are well behaved now. This happened twice to me, both of which occurred when I was about 4 or 5 years old. The first time I was laying in bed with the lights on, about to go to sleep. The door closed, blinds closed, and my bedroom is on the 2nd floor of your typical house. Right beside the bed, I saw the shadow of a man creeping silently. I stared at it for 5 to 10 seconds until it mysteriously vanished through the wall. No one was in my bedroom but me. And I should mention, I wasn't scared or had any negative feelings of this presence. The second time was much the same, but I was on top of my stairs playing with action figures as I heard a noise. I looked down the stairs, and the same type of shadow man was creeping through the hallway. Only my mum and I were home at the time, and my mum was asleep in her room, which was at the top of the stairs. The way the angle was, and how the stairs are situated, it could have been anyone walking near the stairs, like a burglar. Once again, I wasn't scared of this presence. I just didn't understand what it was or what it meant. I just knew it wasn't the ordinary, and definitely wasn't human. I lived in this house for a good 20 more years, and never witnessed anything again. Just random acts where my dogs would bark at nothing. I have two stories, both when feeding neighbors' cats while they were on vacation. The first one is from the neighbor on the left. I was going to her cat's litter box, which was through a hallway, and I felt someone grab my shoulder hard and pull me back towards them. I was almost lifted off my feet, it was so strong. My mum was rooms away, and later we had that neighbor over for Christmas, and she told us that she thinks her mother and father's spirits were still in the house, and that they call her name sometimes. The second is the neighbor to the right. I was with another neighbor/friend, and we were about 14-ish. I wasn't the one getting paid, but it just was fun. The neighbor had 4 cats, and I was with 3 of them, and all of a sudden I heard my name. I thought it was my friend calling me, but she said it wasn't. And after she came and hung out with me on the couch, a minute later, 2 of the cats' hairs stand straight on their backs, and they ran into the bathroom and laid in the bathtub. Then I heard my name much louder. I left, and when I got home I told my parents, and they just kind of look at me. Turns out when I was a baby at about 2, before the other neighbors moved in, there was an older lady who lived there and used to love to play with me. She OD'd and fell asleep in the bathtub, and I do not cat sit anymore. When I was a toddler, my mum tried to save an old woman's life after a car crash, but couldn't. The lady was bleeding out of the side of her head pretty bad and passed away before the ambulance arrived. The next day, my twin brother and I were in the car with our mum when my brother said that there was a grandma sitting in the passenger seat. I piped in and said that she had a boo-boo in her ear, and we told Mum that she wanted to go to the hospital. My mother, superstitious as she was, drove all the way to the hospital and dropped off the old lady there. Mum ended up staying at our grandma's for a week after that. My brother and I always played a game with our mum when she would ask us who was riding in the passenger seat with us on our way to daycare or wherever else. We'd usually say Spider-Man or some cartoon character, but that day was different. When our mum pulled up to the hospital, we told her that the old lady was asking my mum to walk her to the entrance. Once my mum opened the door, walked slowly to the entrance and opened the hospital door and walked back to the car, we both told her that the lady said thank you. My mum was never in the accident, by the way. She just came across the scene, as that's the kind of woman she is. She tried to help however she could. She's always just been very in touch with the paranormal. In 2016, we had to put down my cat, who was 16 years old. He lived a good life and was a very loving cat. In the middle of the night, I would often hear him walking down the hallway, calling out for someone. And as I was always the one to go comfort and cuddle him to reassure him that we were there, he would sleep next to my bed. I had a good connection with him. The night we put him down, I cried my heart out before I went to sleep. I heard him walk down the hallway one last time as he called out. I opened the door and saw him, and he purred, then walked away, and I didn't sleep that night. Earlier in the year, we had to give my dog to my grandmother, who lived 6 hours away from us. It hurt me to see him go, as I was always the one to protect him and comfort him when he broke his paw, and he would sleep in my room. He would always come to comfort me, because he was scared of my cats. And after a month, when he was with my grandmother, I had a dream of him, that he was on my lap, licked my hand, and then went to sleep, and I woke up. The next morning, my family sat me down and told me the news, that he had died from liver failure that night. 2016 was not a good year. This story took place only just last week before Christmas, when me and my friends decided to go out for a few drinks. It was a usual night, but busier than normal, but a great atmosphere. We went to the usual bar we go to that does special craft beers that we love. While in there, my other college friend was there that I hadn't seen in a while, and he was catching up with them. He suggested that we go to this new bar across the street. We finished our drinks and went across to this new place, and it was amazing. The place was jam-packed and had a great welcoming atmosphere. We managed to get a table, and when we ordered, I had to use the bathroom. While walking to the bathroom, I passed this black-haired girl who seen me and said hi while checking me out. I said hi back and proceeded to go to the bathroom. I returned when my college friend said, "I have to go." We said our goodbyes and finished our drinks, and my other friend suggested we go to this late night bar, and we left. Getting in, the place was quieter than usual. It was mainly couples, but we stayed and ordered drinks, and a few hours passed when these 3 girls came in and were at the bar ordering. They were very drunk. And who was with them? The black-haired girl. She saw me, smiled at me, and I smiled back. About 10 minutes later, she came over to my table and said my name. I just looked at her and looked at my friends, which also looked puzzled. What scared me the most was what she said next. She told me my address, hometown, who I was, and all my family. Puzzled, I asked her, did she know me through one of my relations? And she said, "No, I just know you." I'd never seen her in my whole life, just in the other bar earlier. She started talking to my friend, and then I saw her other friend look in horror and walked over and grabbed the black-haired girl away from us. We just looked at each other stunned, confused as to what happened. We decided to go out to the smoking area. While walking to the table, I passed this small blonde woman who called me by my name. I said hi to her, and puzzled, I looked back in the direction where she was, and the girl she was next to said, "You called him by his name." They swiftly left. We soon left, and nothing crazy happened since. Nearly everywhere I go, people always come up to me and talk to me. I seem to have a friendly face, but I have my few shares of creepy encounters. But this story has puzzled me more than scared me. How did they know me? My first story happened when I was working part-time in a town called Franschhoek on the Western Cape of South Africa. I was staying at an old boarding house on the outskirts of town. There were 2 houses on the property. The oldest was the main residence that was still in the old Cape Dutch style and was where the owners lived. The other was hired out to boarders. It was not as old, having built in the mid-1800s. The room I stayed in had an old-fashioned wardrobe against the wall, where I kept my clothes. It was very peaceful, with a terrific view of the town from the window. There was a communal bathroom halfway down the opposite passage. One night I had just turned out the bedside light when I saw a figure approaching the foot of my bed. At first I thought it might be one of the other residents, and I switched the light back on again. The moment I did this, the figure seemed to disappear. I put the light out again, and there it was, right in the spot where I had first seen it. Strange as it seems, I felt no fear at the time, and decided to see what would happen next. The figure was definitely female, dressed in what looked like a nightgown. She started to pirouette in front of me, and then fell to the floor. I turned the light on again, and of course there was no one there. "Come on, dude," I chided myself. "You're seeing things." And I fell asleep soon after that. I didn't say anything the next morning, as I was still convinced that it was just a dream, and was, until it happened, almost a week later. Only this time, I noticed a detail that had escaped my attention before. If the figure had been one of the boarders, she would have had to have come through my door, which was directly in front of my bed. Even with the passage light off, I would have noticed it because the bathroom light shone slightly into my room and was always on. The entity came from the side of my room where the wardrobe stood, and on both occasions the cupboard doors were closed. The same sequence of events played out before me, but this time I did not bother putting the light on. I spoke to the owner the next morning, and she told me that my room once had a bathroom attached. It had been removed so that the room next to mine could be built. To my astonishment, I was also informed that the door was just behind the wardrobe. She said she didn't know much about the history of the place, so she couldn't shed any light on what I had seen. Intrigued, I asked around and was finally introduced to an elderly gent who lived in the senior citizens' home. He said that back in the 1940s, the room was occupied by a young girl from Cape Town. She was a ballet dancer, but was forced to stop because she had cancer. It was so bad that the other residents could see her get worse on an almost daily basis. She loved dancing, and even when she was so sick she could hardly stand, she would try a step or two. And one morning, someone found her lying in the middle of the floor. She was dead. Someone said that he was certain that she tried to dance before collapsing. I will leave you to your own opinion of what I saw. My second encounter. A close friend and I began helping people who had been troubled by occurrences that they could not explain. Many of these ended up being more of a counseling session or suggesting that they seek professional or medical help. But there were others that truly were paranormal. By the time this incident occurred, we had gathered quite a large group, with myself and Tom, as well as two others being the core. One of them, Mark, was a sensei and a Buddhist. One of the members of his dojo approached him, saying that there was something causing a disturbance in the commune that he was running, and so Mark passed the information on to the rest of the group. Tom and I met with the fellow, who we called Eddie, and discovered that he was an ex-British Marine. He had toured in Afghanistan and Iraq before sustaining a serious injury that ended his career in the armed forces. He was also a high-ranking member of the local Freemasons' lodge. Having gone through the house, we discovered a hot spot, or rather, cold spot, in the passage next to one bathroom. I set up a barrier of salt around this area to try and contain whatever might be there, and left strict instructions that no one must interfere with it. It consisted of a pentacle with 5 quartz crystals, one at each point, and we agreed to meet again the following day. and Eddie would tell the other occupants to leave the house that night and only to come back once we had done what needed to be done. The next morning, we were told that Martin, our fourth member, would be late because of car trouble. The three of us decided that we would begin without him. The first sign that something was definitely wrong happened just after we arrived. Tom went to the bathroom checking my salt barrier en route, and it was still intact. Mark, Eddie, and I were the only other people in the house. When Tom came out, however, the crystals had been removed and were now neatly lined up against a closed door at the opposite end of the passage. I had to reset the barrier. Not long after that, Mark came and told me that the pentacle had been tampered with again. That was when we decided to try and track whatever was doing these things down. We could definitely sense whenever it was near. Just like the spot in the passage, it would suddenly turn cold, as if an icy wind had brushed past it. Tom and Mark headed down the passage that had a bend in it to the left, while Eddie and I waited at the opposite end, near where the salt barrier was. Eddie whispered that he had sensed something, and headed forward to where the turn in the passage was. He was wearing a Kevlar vest. I was tail end churly, and suddenly I heard a low grunt, followed by a dull thud next to me, and there was Eddie flat on his back, his face white as a sheet. "What just happened?" I asked. "Something hit me," came the reply. By this time, Tom and Mark had come to see what was going on. We helped Eddie back to his feet and headed to the sitting room. We thought it best to wait until Martin arrived before we continued. Eddie was complaining that his chest was sore. When he removed his flak jacket, to our horror, we could all see what looked like 2 claw marks across from his shoulder to almost the middle of his ribcage. The skin wasn't broken, but there were 2 parallel welts where he had been struck. As I said, this was a hardened, battled Marine, and he was so spooked that he was shaking. He said, "I've dealt with many bad things before, but most of them I could see. This was the first time I was assaulted by something I could not." Martin arrived soon after, and we eventually got rid of whatever it was. But it took a guy with many more years' experience in the paranormal than us in order to succeed. When I was around 12, I spent New Year's Eve at my friend's house whilst our parents were out to a restaurant in a nearby town. The house was old and pretty isolated, and to be honest, it scared the crap out of me. You had to drive up a long, overgrown track to reach it. A lot of my other friends at school would say the house was haunted, and it was actually featured in a ghost book if I remember rightly. So anyway, we were sat downstairs in the lounge watching some TV and heard the loudest crashing sound. I still remember the look in my friend's eyes when we turned to each other in shock. It took us a while to get up and actually go investigate where the sound was coming from and what it was. We crept out the lounge down the hallway to the rest of the house. The crashing sounded like it came from upstairs, so we headed up to check it out. When we got to the top of the stairs, there was a breeze coming from somewhere. It was ice cold. We moved down the hallway upstairs towards the wind and turned to go down another corridor. Bear in mind this house was massive, and honestly, it was near enough a mansion from the 1920s. At the end of the corridor was his parents' bedroom. The door was moving back and forth slowly. We both stopped and just stood still, frozen and not saying a word to each other. After a moment, my friend walked towards the door. I was still frozen in fear and fell behind a little. As he pushed the door open and snuck into the room, the darkness consumed him. I could barely make out his silhouette. There was perfect silence for a few seconds before I heard him let out the most terrifying scream. My adrenaline kicked in, and I ran towards the room to see what had happened. I searched for the light and turned it on. He was stood frozen stiff and pale, just staring into an empty corner of the room. Just to the side of him was a massive antique mirror that was smashed into pieces, with shards of glass scattered all over the floor. I placed my arm on his shoulder and asked him if he was okay.
"She broke the mirror."
"Who?"
"The woman in the corner. She told me to."
At that point, I was honestly like, screw this, and told him we should leave. He turned to leave with me, and just before we did, I wanted to check the mirror. Surely the wire had broken or something. I bent down to inspect, turned it over, and the string that was still holding it to the wall was intact. It hadn't snapped. I looked at the wall. The nail was also still firmly fixed to the wall. At that point, I was so terrified, I told him to call his parents and tell them to come home. We waited outside the front door until our parents arrived from the restaurant. My dad and his went straight up to the bedroom to check it out. When they arrived, they saw the broken mirror. They sort of pushed it off and said we were up to no good and playing a game that got out of hand. And after that night, my friend never really spoke about it to me. The worst part is that I'm 24 now and was having a general chat with my mum as New Year's is coming up soon. That night came up. I told her about it and she said, "I believe you. Your friend's mum told me a few days after that night that she had seen a woman in her room telling her to leave the house." It honestly sent my whole body tingling, and I had flashbacks to that night. It's honestly sent my whole body tingling, and I had flashbacks to that night, with it being 12 years ago now. To this day, I still can't work out how the mirror fell off the wall. It would have had to have been physically lifted up and over the hook. I think it's best if I just forget it. I don't like trying to picture the woman my friend kept saying he saw. When I was 12, my dog Lizzie, who was probably 12 as well at the time, became very sick. We took her to the vet and found out she had an aggressive tumor in her abdominal area that was quickly growing. She was having strokes, vomiting, and she was very fatigued. My mum let me miss school the next day if I wanted to, but I chose to go in order to get my mind off things, and so did my little brother. My older sister decided to stay home with my mum, and we all got in the car that morning with Lizzie, and she sat in the front of my sister's lap. After I got out the car at school, I started walking over to the window where she was sitting and gave her a kiss goodbye, because I didn't know if I'd get to see her again. I couldn't stop thinking of her all day. At around noon right after lunch, I was in my maths class. I was sitting at my desk taking notes as my teacher gave her lesson as usual, and out of the blue, I felt what I can only describe as a punch to my heart, and I knew Lizzie was gone. I could almost feel her cuddling me in my lap one last time before she left. It was like she'd come to say goodbye. I came home later that day to find my mum and sister gave Lizzie the best last day a dog could have, and took her to the vet where she was put to sleep, which happened around noon. I knew it sounds cheesy, but that's the most paranormal thing I've ever personally experienced. Lizzie got sick so suddenly that we could hardly believe it. So treat every day with your animals for granted. You never know when it will be the last time you get to see them. Two years after my dad had passed away, I was living in Oregon for the first time and decided to take a day trip to see the Painted Hills. But this trip was further than I had planned, and being in the dead of winter, the weather was horrible. Freezing fog made visibility near zero, and I headed back towards Portland, and rather than risking hitting snow in the mountains, I veered north through the desert. Unfortunately, conditions in the desert were the same. I couldn't see a thing. There were no other cars on the highway, and in stretches where there were no reflectors, I'd find myself drifting far off the road. To make matters worse, I hadn't slept well the night before, and was starting to fall asleep at the wheel. My CD player wasn't working, and there had been no radio for an hour. Just static, fog, and darkness, lulling me into deadly delirium. Me crashing my car had pretty much been my dad's worst nightmare. It was the thing we talked about most when it came to safety. I will also mention here that my dad loved the band Chicago, which we gave him a lot of grief for. Because suddenly, in the middle of nowhere, the radio signal came back, which is good because my eyes were closed and I was off the road asleep. I was awoken to the sound of voices. A song. The lyrics went, "You're the meaning in my life. You're my inspiration." And I felt like my dad was with me. I rolled down the window so the freezing air could keep me awake, and I turned up the radio as loud as I could and shouted that song all the way through. I started crying. The song ended and the signal faded back to static. I know how unlikely that sounds, but it happened that way. I might have just been driving back behind some hills and lost signal rapidly, but it happened right when the song ended, and I didn't even hear a radio call sign. I made it back home safely. I don't pretend to draw any certain conclusions about what happened. I just know the music came on in time to save my life before I left the road completely. This was roughly a decade and some change ago. I was in 6th grade and was home alone because of Christmas break and divorced parents. I lived in one of the bigger towns of Alaska and lived in a middle-class neighborhood. Houses spaced pretty far apart with very long driveways down each, but the next-door neighbors knew us well enough to know if something didn't look right. It was around 4 p.m. I believe, and my mum was off working early, but stopped to get some groceries. Kind of a gift in itself to not go shopping. I hadn't grown out of my back problems yet, and couldn't stand walking around for over an hour. Anyway, I was in my room watching a movie with Jackie Chan, Around the World in 80 Days, when I heard a knock on the door. I didn't answer, thinking whoever it would just be asking for my mum and dad about solar panels or something. But when I heard it getting louder and louder, and around the 3rd time it got louder, I started to get scared. I was always told to call the cops if people would act suspicious, but I guess I was too terrified in that moment. Being in pajamas and enjoying my favorite movie at the time, I just didn't feel like it. So, not knowing what to do while 2 guys are literally banging on the door, I call my mum and I tell her what's going on. And she says it's probably just Mormons. Now for you guys, that might be a normal thing, but I live in Alaska and I don't even know what a Mormon is. And to not worry. I told her that it kept getting louder, and I'd thought they might break the door down. It was still pretty big, and thick stained glass at chest height, but she told me to calm down. But then she heard it. This only took place within about a minute, but every 10 seconds or so, the banging would get louder. This is when she began to freak out. She told me to stay right in my room with the door locked and to not make a sound as she called the cops. So we hang up, and while I wait for my dad to answer my call, I'm looking around for anything in my room. I grabbed a t-ball bat and sat on my bed, freaking out. And I didn't have a window facing the front of the house, just the side. Finally, my dad answers and I tell him what's going on, and that Mum was calling the cops right now. He wasn't legally allowed to be on the property, but he's very protective. He lived very close to the police station at the time and raced over to me. While I'm waiting and waiting for the police to arrive or my mum, I decide to peek my head out. The way the house was set up, I could stalk out my bedroom door and see the backyard, and without walking more than 2 steps, able to peek out of the corner and see through the living room bay window. I saw that they'd reversed their car almost right up to the garage door, and I could partially see through the door 2 men pounding away at it. I stayed there and saw the first guy send the other around back, and saw his face as he went to walk around the house. I hid before he could see me and waited. I realized after what they were doing, and the one around the back tried to open our glass sliding doors on the balcony. Thankfully, not only was it locked, but it also had a piece of wood, so even if they overpowered the lock, they couldn't open it more than an inch. He started to try to break it as well, and then my mum called me back, crying and wanting to know if I was okay. She was pulled over at the store's gas station and said that the police would be there ASAP and that she was making her way right now. After about a minute of them both trying the front and back door, they regrouped back near the front door, and I was really tired of them making me feel scared. So I walked out of my room to the front door, yelling at them in a tank top and shorts holding a bat. They didn't hear me until I was right at the door and spooked them. They ran to their car to drive away, and only when they got into the car did I open the door to keep yelling at them. I forgot what I was yelling, but they drove off. My mum got home a few minutes after and held me until my dad came, and I went out to his truck and showed him I was all right and told him how I scared them off. He hugged me, gave me a kiss, and left before him and my mum could fight over him being there. Thankfully, she didn't care at all, and she kept talking to me about the men until the cops came half an hour later. He didn't seem interested in talking to me until I told him that I could easily tell him the face of the guy at the front door, and a little of the other guy as well. He said he suspected that they were a group that had been breaking in the past 2 weeks, stealing Christmas presents and other stuff. They were found a few weeks later and were linked to over 10 burglaries. The same night they tried to break in, I had my best friend come over, and we sat up all night with my bat and his. I used to live in a building that was rumored to be haunted. It was a 5-story walk-up with 2 apartments on each floor. I lived in one of the apartments at the top floor, but only ever had small incidents that I thought were fairly explainable. I had a cat who'd I'd cared for since he was 2 months old, and by that time he was 16 and dying of cancer. The vet was really nice and came over to put him to sleep so he wouldn't have to go to the clinic. The night after he died, I woke up at 2 in the morning and could hear sounds like furniture being moved down the stairs, and thought someone was stealing the patio furniture that my neighbor and I kept on the roof. I ran out of bed, but when I opened the door there was no one there, but I could still hear the scraping and moving. I would have thought it was just a dream, but my neighbor came out of the apartment too and started crying out of fear. She also wanted to call the cops, but in the end decided they wouldn't take her seriously anyway. I went back to bed, but woke up around dawn and felt the spirit of my recently deceased cat jump up to the bed then climb up my leg and sit on my chest, purring, exactly like he used to every day. I was fully awake, and he jumped off the bed, and I felt his presence disappear. Even if this was some kind of complex hallucination, I'm really glad I had it, because I loved that cat. I was in basic training at Fort Knox, and we were on a very long road march when out of nowhere this beautiful yellow lab with no collar that looks exactly like my dog at home comes up to me and walks beside me, of all people, for a few minutes before running back into the woods. This was a big boost to me, because you need to finish the march as one of the requirements to graduate, and I was dragging ass due to stress fractures in my feet. I was able to finish, and we earned some phone time to call home, where my mum informed me they had to put down my dog. She was sick before I left, and they were hoping that she would hold on another week, but she just got too bad. When that dog came up to me, literally out of nowhere, there weren't any houses around for miles. One of the things her and I loved to do was to go on runs together, so I like to think she was coming to say one last goodbye. Last year, my family and our friends reserved 2 houses for us to celebrate the New Year's Eve on. One house was for me and my parents, and the other one was for our friends. As we arrived and greeted each other, we sat around this big table and started talking and playing tabletop games. We were all in the first house at this point, and as you can imagine, I was pretty bored after a while, so I began playing on my phone. But my battery eventually started to drain, so I wanted to grab my charger from my room in the second house. I grabbed the keys, went to go outside, and opened the second door and put the key in the closest corner of the table. I intentionally put them there so that as I'm unpacking my stuff, I don't lose them somehow. You know how it goes with your keys or your phone. It's super easy to lose them, and then they're nowhere to be found. Anyway, back to the story. I had to be careful since we only had 1 key per house, and after I left the key on the table, I went up to my room and grabbed the charger. It took me about 2 to 3 minutes, and as I went downstairs, the keys were gone. I instantly froze, and shivers went down my spine. My hair stood up, and tears were pushed into my eyes. I was freaked the hell out. Adrenaline flooded my body, and I gained courage, clenched my fists, and started screaming. All of this happened in a matter of seconds. I don't know if you get that feeling when you're scared and brave at the same time. I looked around and saw the keys were now on the kitchen counter, 4 meters away from the spot I had put them on. I knew that it wasn't much that could happen, and I'm not the type that suffers short-term memory loss, but in any case, I grabbed them and ran. This is circa 2001 to 2003, in Morgantown, Indiana, at a place called Auntie M's Tea Room, which sadly no longer exists. On 3 separate occasions while cleaning up after closing time, I heard what sounded like a small child crying. It was soft, and every time I tried to walk towards the sound, it seemed to grow further away, or at least move to a different part of the restaurant altogether. It was unnerving, to say the least. A friend of mine worked there with me, and once after hours she heard me call her name from inside the stockroom, and at the time I heard her call her name from the front of the restaurant. We ran into each other on our way to answer the calls. We were both very confused when we realized neither of us had actually called each other. Lastly, and most chillingly, 2 people I knew passed away very shortly after eating at Auntie M's, and I was the person that served them their last meals on both occasions. One passed in an accident, and the other of a heart attack. Was it just their time to go? I don't know. But it really creeped me out that in that restaurant, I've served 2 people their last meals on Earth. On Christmas Day 2016, I participated in a gift exchange with my mum and her boyfriend's family. Long story short, I ended up getting this pretty good bottle of this vanilla-flavored whiskey. I'd like to add that this took place in northern Alberta country, where it's pretty secluded and cold at this time of year, and I do mean cold. Now the real story. So towards the end of the day, I decided to go have myself a fire and taste my new whiskey at our dugout just down the road. I was there hanging out for about an hour by myself, and everything was normal as usual. It's dark and starry at night, hardly a breeze in the woods, and it's quiet with the exception of the occasional vehicle passing on the highway right beside this area. I finally decide to crack open the hooch and mix myself a whiskey and cola. As I'm sipping my drink, the flames of the fire die down as most of the wood was burnt up. So I add a log or two and begin to blow the embers to raise the flames. As I blow, I hear this loud, percussive knock. Not cracking, not popping, but a knock. Wood on wood. No mistake about it. I estimate the sound to be roughly within 20 yards. It was crystal clear and loud. My heart is beating 1,000,000 miles an hour. My grip tightens around my utility shovel, the only protection I have, and I remain as still as possible with my head facing the blackness of the woods where I heard the knock. I have no flashlight to shine in the area, aside from my iPhone light, which was useless. I wait for whoever or whatever it was to make a move. I'm convinced that somehow someone stopped on the highway and snuck up on me without noticing and was trying to mess with me. I should add that my town is quite rough. A lot of criminal activity happens here. Thievery, robberies, occasional shooting, as there's a decent amount of crazy folk here. So as I'm waiting for whoever/whatever to make a move, I consider yelling out, "Who's there?" I resist that urge, however, as I was so amped up that if someone was going to answer my call, I was sure that I would charge and seriously injure the person out of fear. So I sit out quietly for a few minutes and listen. After about 2 minutes without hearing anything, I decide to pack up. I very gently and slowly gather up my cup, whiskey bottle and garbage into my backpack and make my way to the quad, all while listening and watching that same area. The quad was parked about 5 yards ahead of me in the direction of the knock. As I turn on my quad, the lights are shining in that direction. I take a quick look at the woods ahead of me to see if I can notice anything, but there's nothing. So I hightail it out of there and quickly park the quad in the garage and head inside for bed. I get up the next day and head back out to look for tracks, as it had snowed Christmas Day. A fresh, new 1 to 2 inch blanket of snow covered the land, and I was convinced I'd find the tracks of whoever/whatever made the knock. I walk over to the area and see nothing, so I decide to circle the whole dugout just to be sure there wasn't anything. I didn't see a single disturbance in the snow aside from my own tracks, not even any rabbit tracks. I was completely alone. I tried to come up with an explanation, but none make any sense to me, except for one, a person. No footprints, as I would have heard crunching in the snow trying to sneak up. 2, an animal, but there are no tracks. What animal can grab a piece of wood and nod? Could it have been threesing, fouring, a big branch falling, a Sasquatch, a spirit? All these possibilities raced through my mind. When my mind reflected on the spirit option, Could it have been my dog or my grandmother telling me to go home right now? As if I'd have stayed out there, I wouldn't have made it home alive. Although I didn't plan on getting drunk, I am a lightweight, and the possibility of me getting drunk and nodding off was a serious possibility. This is also the first time I've ever drank in the woods. I've been out at night a million times before, and never had anything like this happen until I brought booze out. I'd like to finish this story by informing you all that I lost a friend about a year after this incident, due to drinking and freezing to death. I can't help but think of some wild, crazy theories that was him from the future. I'm sure he'd laugh at that theory. I certainly miss that guy. A year before my son was born, my boyfriend's father died. I'd never met him before, but heard stories of his twisted sense of humor and how he liked to mess with people. My boyfriend wasn't particularly close to his dad. We lived together in North Carolina, and his dad had taken off to Seattle when my boyfriend was young. I don't think my boyfriend really grieved until our son was born, and he realized that his dad would never meet him. That hit him hard. Over the first month of caring for our newborn, we started to notice screws that had fallen out of household items. Kitchen chairs, towel racks, screen doors, outlet covers. The most random stuff. More than a dozen loose screws in the span of a week. Kind of weird, but we were sleep-deprived parents and didn't really have the mental stamina to waste trying to figure it out. One day we were chilling in the living room, and a screw falls out of the light fixture and lands in my boyfriend's lap. He starts laughing hysterically so hard he can't breathe. When he finally calms down, he tells me what set him off, and he holds the screw up and said, "I finally get it. My dad is screwing with me." We never had a loose screw since.